Joe Mebane, and I would like to take the next few minutes to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been a Christian for a little over 20 years now, and for pretty much the entirety of that time, I felt called to the ministry. I have a Master's of Divinity from Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary out in California, and during the time that I was attending seminary out there, I worked at a Korean church down in San Jose. After graduation, I went through a time of growth and maturity or maturation, both personally in the ways that I deal with life and life circumstances, but also spiritually in my relationship with God. And I believe that God grows a Christian for His reasons and for His purposes. Looking back, I can see that those purposes were to prepare me for the ministry roles that He would have. However, through this time of preparation, God led me down a different path than the normal church-related work areas or work fields, such as pastor or youth pastor or music minister. I was a school teacher at Christian schools, 2 different Christian schools, for 5 years. And I would like to take the next few minutes to detail or to explain how I believe that my experience as a school teacher in Christian schools can translate over into the normal or typical ministry-related experience, such as pastor, or especially such as youth pastor. I would also like to take the next few minutes to allow prospective churches to get to know me a little bit better, both in my personality and my demeanor and the way I present myself and so on.
My 5 years of teaching started with my work at Clay Road Baptist School in Houston, Texas. I taught 2nd grade my first year and 4th grade my 2nd year. I was under the leadership of Bobette Down, who, consequently, was also my mentor during my last year of seminary. She was my mentor for supervised ministry. Following Clay Road, my wife and I moved to Mississippi, where we both taught at Tupelo Christian Preparatory School. The principal there was Mr. Ronnie Golston, and the headmaster at the time was David Culpepper. So, how can I point out that and compare work in a Christian school to that of what is normally considered a paid staff position at a church? Well, first, I would like to point out that both of these schools started off as a ministry of a local church. And in the case of Clay Road, the school is located inside of the actual church building. The school could not help but be influenced by the life of the church. And secondly, because of the school's close affiliation with the church, I was able to build and develop close relationships with the families that I minister to, both the children or students and their parents. And the way I saw it, I was not only investing in their lives, but I was also working toward training up the next generation of believers. My role was of a spiritual leader inside of a classroom instead of a sanctuary or a youth building. As such, I believe that the classroom of a Christian school can be compared very much to a youth group, except for the fact that you're with your students for 5 days a week instead of just Sundays or Wednesdays. I believe that this exposure develops similar leadership skills and qualities of a minister in a church. As such, I can easily compare my headmasters, and I had 2 great headmasters, or principals, to having similar role to that of a lead pastor or a senior pastor in a church. My wife and I have collected a few cookbooks in the nearly 10 years that we have been married. And throughout those years, I have tried numerous recipes. Some of them have turned out great, some not so great. But the ones I've enjoyed the most, the ones that have become my specialties, if you will, are the bread recipes and the dessert recipes. Now, there are times when I will make a certain recipe over and over and over again. It becomes my favorite for one reason or another. I've even tried to alter the recipe to the one I've enjoyed so much to some degree to see if I can make it better. Most of the time, I don't make it better. Most of the time, I figure out that you cannot mess with perfection. Now, the thing with following a recipe and eating whatever it is that you're making all those times, that dessert or that loaf of bread, is that eventually it loses its newness, its originality after a while. You get tired with it. And sometimes you take a break from making it. Sometimes that time is a week, sometimes it's a month, sometimes you don't make that recipe for a year or more. But in the end, my desire for a good recipe always wins out, and I eventually return back to it. And when I do, half the time I can't remember where I put that recipe, whether it's in a cookbook or whether it's lying out somewhere. I just don't remember. So my lazy self thinks that I can pull off making whatever it is by memory. Forget the recipe. I've done this enough times that I don't need to search for it. I can do it by myself. However, inevitably, I always forget some small but vital part or ingredient, or because of that, I'll have to go searching for it, because I know it just won't turn out the way it should. For you see, it's those details in a recipe, those individual items that sometimes you just forget, those significant numbers and measurements, the 3/4 of this or 1 cup of that, that make the recipe what it is, or make it unique. Now, I need to point out that just like details make a recipe interesting, details also can make life just as interesting. One characteristic of God that I really admire is that He is interested in the details of life. He closely follows the human story, the human history, if you will. He is interested in every little thing that happens to us. They are important to Him. He cares about them. He cares about us. And it just so happens, the book I'm going to talk about, the chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, we find that God is a God of details. Ruth is a small book. It's only 4 chapters. But it is packed full of details that, depending on how deep you go into it, you're going to find how abundantly these details reveal how abundantly God, how abundantly God is part of our lives. So in verse 1, we find that my wife and I have collected a few cookbooks in the nearly 10 years that we have been married. And throughout those years, I have tried numerous recipes. Some of them have turned out great, some not so great. But the ones I've enjoyed the most, the ones that have become my specialties, if you will, are the bread recipes and the dessert recipes. Now, there are times when I will make a certain recipe over and over and over again. It becomes my favorite for one reason or another. I've even tried to alter the recipe to the one I've enjoyed so much to some degree to see if I can make it better. Most of the time, I don't make it better. Most of the time, I figure out that you cannot mess with perfection. Now, the thing with following a recipe and eating whatever it is that you're making all those times, that dessert or that loaf of bread, is that eventually it loses its newness, its originality after a while. You get tired with it. And sometimes you take a break from making it. Sometimes that time is a week, sometimes it's a month, sometimes you don't make that recipe for a year or more. But in the end, my desire for a good recipe always wins out, and I eventually return back to it. And when I do, half the time I can't remember where I put that recipe, whether it's in a cookbook or whether it's lying out somewhere. I just don't remember. So my lazy self thinks that I can pull off making whatever it is by memory. Forget the recipe. I've done this enough times that I don't need to search for it. I can do it by myself. However, inevitably, I always forget some small but vital part or ingredient, or because of that, I'll have to go searching for it, because I know it just won't turn out the way it should. For you see, it's those details in a recipe, those individual items that sometimes you just forget, those significant numbers and measurements, the 3/4 of this or 1 cup of that, that make the recipe what it is, or make it unique. Now, I need to point out that just like details make a recipe interesting, details also can make life just as interesting. One characteristic of God that I really admire is that He is interested in the details of life. He closely follows the human story, the human history, if you will. He is interested in every little thing that happens to us. They are important to Him. He cares about them. He cares about us. And it just so happens, the book I'm going to talk about, the chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, we find that God is a God of details. Ruth is a small book. It's only 4 chapters. But it is packed full of details that, depending on how deep you go into it, you're going to find how abundantly these details reveal how abundantly God, how abundantly God is part of our lives. So in verse 1, we find that, so if you would open up your Bible to Ruth chapter 1, let's start reading here in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. We find that it begins by saying, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there." It should be pointed out, just like the details make a recipe interesting, details also make life interesting. In the book of Ruth, we find lots and lots of details. But first I must ask, if God is a God of details, why is there a famine in His land, in the land of Israel? These are God's chosen people. The Jews were blessed by God to represent His glory to the nations. They were His. I was an English major for a total of 1.5 years. I actually took 1 English class on the master's level during that time. I wrote in one of my papers that the Jews were God's chosen people. The Jews were God's people. And my professor, who happened to be a Christian, asked me, "Is God a Jew? Is God a Jew? Why are you saying that the Jews are His people?" And I thought about that for a minute, and what I came up with was that there are plenty of instances where God calls this group of stiff-necked and stubborn people His own special possession. They're His. He's claimed them. Out of all the nations in the world, He wants them to be His and to show who He is to the nations around. But there was a famine in the land of Israel during this time. So I have to ask, why do good things happen to good people? Well, I suppose the response could be, who's to say that the Jews during this time were good people? Verse 1 tells us that this is a time when the judges ruled. There was a famine in the land, and the judges ruled. Now we know that the judges ruled Israel about 3,000 years ago. We have Joshua. Moses told Joshua, I'm about to die, so take this group of people and lead them to the promised land. Help them to conquer the nations that are living there. Help them to settle down and help them to prosper. And that's what he did. After Joshua died, we had judges who ruled, who governed, who watched over the people of Israel. And the very last part of the book of Judges, which after the last chapter of Judges, we have the first chapter of Ruth, but the very last part of the book of Judges, we find that the people, the Israelites, the people of God, God's chosen nation, they did whatever they wanted to. They didn't consider God. They didn't do what he wanted. They didn't choose to follow him. They did what was right in their own eyes, regardless if it honored God or not. They didn't care. If it suited them and they wanted to do it, well, they did it. Now, how many times can we relate to that in our own lives? Today, we're Christians. We are God's chosen people. We are chosen by him to represent him to the nations. But how many times are we the stiff-necked, how many times are we the stubborn people of today's times that are supposed to reflect his glory to the world? Some people may ask things like, well, we have Hurricane Katrina, or we have wildfires in California, or flooding in Colorado, or any other natural or numerous disasters that happen to our great nation. Well, they're judgments from God. Are they? Or are they just natural causes at work here? Well, what's happening here with this famine? Is it a judgment from God because the people are doing what's right in their own eyes instead of following God? Or is it just a natural happening? Something that would have happened anyway, regardless. It's interesting to note that verse 2 of chapter 1 tells us that this man from Bethlehem went with his wife and his 2 sons to Moab. And Moab, by the way, was just a mere little 50 miles away from Israel. It was a neighboring nation, and it wasn't very far away. But it wasn't affected by the famine. It didn't have a famine. It had food, and plenty of it. This was a pagan and foreign nation that did not honor and follow God and his commandments. A nation that apparently was not under the same famine as Israel, even though it was just 50 miles away. This is some of the details that we find in Ruth. Ruth is full of interesting things like this that once upon, if you look at and make it a deeper study, you find out a lot that might not be there at surface level. But this man from Bethlehem took his wife, his 2 sons, and went there to a foreign land that didn't worship the same God that he did. Now let's look at this man. His name was Elimelech. If we were to translate Elimelech into English, we get this: my God is king. My God is king. Elimelech's name was my God is king. You're walking down the street, you want to say hi to him, you say, hi, my God is king, how are you doing? And he would respond. The question begs to be asked, why would someone whose name is my God is king desire to go to a country where God was not king, where they worshipped a foreign god? Where is Elimelech's trust? Where is my God is king? Where is his trust? Maybe he was trusting in what he heard. Elimelech, the land of Moab has food. You need to go there. Or maybe he was trusting in his own strength. Elimelech, you're the man of the house. You must provide for your family. Was he trusting in God to provide for all of his needs? And is it easy for us to judge him here in the 21st century? They say hindsight is 2020, but what do we do today that takes our faith and our focus away from God? The same God that Elimelech knew. They said, or a week from today, a week from the day that I'm recording this sermon, we are supposed to default as a nation. The debt limit will be reached. We won't have enough money to pay our debts, and world chaos is supposed to happen. The United States is supposed to go into turmoil, and life as we know it is just supposed to end. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what critics are saying. Makes you wonder, though, should I pack up and just leave? Should I go to another country? Should I go to a land that's more prosperous, where I can find a better job, where I can make more money, where I can support my family? Should I just forget my life as I know it here and move somewhere else? Or does God want me here, no matter what may come, no matter what may the United States, what may happen to it? Does God want me here for a purpose, to serve Him somehow through the hard times, through difficult times, through the famine that may or may not come tomorrow or in the future? Where does God want me? Am I to pack up and leave? Or do I let God be God where He has me, where He has planted me for right now? Do I represent God and His glory to the rest of the world? Can they tell that I am different? Verse 2 tells us that Elimelech was an Ephrathite of Bethlehem. Scholars tell us that an Ephrathite was a chief family of Bethlehem. In fact, Ephrath was an old name for Bethlehem itself. We see, if we were to turn to Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, we see this verse. But you, Bethlehem Ephrath, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. We have there, but you, Bethlehem, and then that title, Ephrath, or Ephrathah. So it is quite possible that Elimelech, who was an Ephrathite, it's quite possible that he might have been, him and his family, an ancient family, might have been one of the last godly influences in Bethlehem that Bethlehem had left. Remember, this was the time of the judges, a time when people did what was right in their own eyes. They did not regard and consider what God wanted them to do. Perhaps Elimelech, my God is king, was the last godly influence in Bethlehem. We don't know, but whatever the reasons for Elimelech going, for whatever the reasons were that Elimelech wanted to leave Israel and go to Moab, he did not count the spiritual cost for moving his family away from the people of faith. Maybe it looked right financially, but he was depriving his wife and his children of other godly influences and friends. We do things our own way sometimes, don't we? We do things our own way and in our own timing. But how often do we look back on our decisions and realize that God was not really in them? Do we count the spiritual cost for what might seem like a good idea at the time, but in the long run that will leave us spiritually bankrupt and far away from what God and where God really wants us? How often do we plunge ahead when God wants us to be still where we are and wait on Him? Sometimes it's in the daily, it's in the mundane, it's in the ordinary things of life that God is most at work. Sometimes it's in the simple act of taking the trash out, like I do every Tuesday to the end of my driveway, that God teaches us perseverance. Sometimes it's in showing up to work each and every day to a job that we might have gotten tired of years ago, that God teaches us loyalty and how to serve Him even when we might not feel like it. Sometimes it's in the continued act of reading that Bible story to your children right before they go to bed, right when they're the wiggliest and the craziest, that God teaches them something that He might not could have otherwise. You see, being devoted to the details of life that God has placed us in sometimes means glorifying Him in the daily, in the mundane, and the ordinary. Those details, those small details that God places us through, are to build our character and to mature our faith in Him. Did Elimelech have this kind of persevering faith? Well, apparently not. For he took his wife and his 2 boys and left when times got hard, when life seemed too much to bear, when quite possibly God was willing and ready to do something great in this family, this ancient family of Bethlehem. Let's look at some more details here in the book of Ruth. I've mentioned that Elimelech, his name means my God is king, but his wife, Naomi, if you translate her name, you get pleasant or pleasant one. So when people talked to her, when they saw her down the street, they would say, "Hey, pleasant, how are you doing? Hey, pleasant one, good to see you." And then we have his 2 boys, Mahlon, which means sickly, and Chilion, which means frail. I have to point out that during this time, during the famine, the mortality rate was very high, so they usually did not give kids names until they were weaned, maybe around age 2 or so. So it's quite possible that Mahlon and Chilion were very sickly, were very frail, and once they survived, once they were old enough for their parents to realize, well, we might have 2 sons and it might actually make it, then their parents gave them names, sickly and frail. And maybe those names reflected how they were, their life, their growing up period, those first 2 years. Let's move on. Let's look at verses 3 through 5. Verse 3 says this, "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died." Where did he die? He died in Moab. "And she was left with her 2 sons. They, the sons, married Moabite women. One was named Orpah and the other was Ruth. After a while, they lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and without her husband." Now, whoever says that there is no irony in the Bible has never read the book of Ruth. How ironic is it that Elimelech leaves Israel, goes to Moab to find life, to find food, to find security, to find a life worth living. And while he is there, not only does he die, but his sons die too, leaving his wife, leaving their mother, a widow and without any hope. That's their decision. That's what the men did. That's where verses 1 through 5 have us. But starting in verse 6, we see a transition. We see something different happening. After all, the book is named after a woman, Ruth. And we see the characters going from males, the main characters going from males to women. Ruth now takes center stage. Naomi now takes center stage. All of a sudden, from here on out, we have male characters, but the book itself is about Ruth. It's about what Naomi does and helps along with Ruth. So we have a transition. But not only are the characters in transition, but the food supply is in transition. For we see in verse 6 tells us that, verse 6 says, "When Naomi heard in Moab," she's still in Moab, "that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So they made the long road together. They set out on the road that would take them back to Judah, but somewhere along the way, it must be pointed out, starting in verse 8, it says that then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept out loud. And they said to her, "No, we will go back with you to your people." But Naomi insisted. She said, "Return home, my daughters. Why should you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than it is for you, because the Lord, his hand has turned against me. It is more bitter for me, says Naomi, than it is for you two. So in essence, she is telling her 2 daughters-in-law that if they follow her, she's warning them that the life ahead is without hope. The prospect for marriage is slim. The prospect for food is near none. The prospect for security and for a life well lived, it just probably is not going to happen. Ruth, Orpah, if you follow me, chances are you're going to be miserable. So instead, please go home. Go home to your family. Go home to where you can find another husband. Go home to where that husband can give you children, and those children can grow up and support you in your old age. Please go home to where you can have a life worth living. But they refused. They chose their mother-in-law. So Naomi had to beg them to leave. And finally, Orpah, which if we pause here for a minute and we look at the name Orpah, Orpah means to turn one's back. Orpah does a sensible thing. Orpah does the practical thing. She leaves. She turns around and goes back home. Life existed for her back home. It's true that she loved her mother-in-law. It's true that she wanted to go with her mother-in-law, but she saw what her mother-in-law was saying. It made sense to her. So she turned her back and she went back home. It made sense. It was the practical thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do. Ruth, on the other hand, does not do the sensible and the practical thing. I mean, who in their right mind would leave security for a life of the unknown? She's going to follow her mother-in-law to a strange new land and begin a strange new life. It must be pointed out here that to be a widow during this time is similar to being homeless in today's time here in the United States. There is nothing for her. There is nothing for them. Naomi didn't have any prospects for security, for making a living, for survival even. She had nothing. The only hope that she might have had, that she maybe could have had, was if somehow her relatives back home in Israel were still alive. And not only were they still alive, but they were well off enough to help support her. And if not, then she truly was lost. She was moving for a lost cause. So what Ruth is doing here does not really make sense. Ruth chooses a life of possible destitution and extreme poverty over a life of known safety and of her people and of her family. This is either true devotion or it's insanity. Imagine reading this for the first time. Imagine it was just written thousands of years ago and you picked it up and someone read it to you for the first time. If that had happened to me, if I had just heard the story, I personally would wonder, what in the world is Ruth doing? She is free. Her mother-in-law just freed her to do the sensible, to do the responsible, to do the normal thing. But she's choosing a life with her mother-in-law over a life of her family back home. And you can also look at it this way. Not only is she choosing a life of the unknown, but she's choosing a life with a different God. She's choosing a life of a different lifestyle altogether. This is the difference between heaven and hell to Ruth. It would be, say, as if we, as Christians, decided to become a Muslim and go and live in Iraq or Iran. Not only is Iraq or Iran a different lifestyle than here in the United States, but it's a different religion altogether. Ruth, in essence, is saying, I'm going to leave what I know and I'm going to follow you. Maybe then, starting in verse 16, what she has to say makes so much sense. Because, and Ruth replied in verse 16 to Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or to turn my back from you. For where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. She was willing to give up not only her security back home, but her faith and her trust in her God in order to trust Naomi's God. The difference between heaven and hell, the difference between financial security and a life of destitution, the difference between eternity, knowing and secure of where you're going, and the difference between completely abandoning your faith for something completely different. Verse 18 says, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, her mind was set, she was determined, I'm going to leave my old life in order to follow a new life, Naomi stopped urging her. That choice, then, is what Ruth is doing here. Let me leave the life I know for a life that is foreign to you, or foreign to me. I will follow you, Naomi, whatever that might mean. God's love for us can be characterized, can be described in one word. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, that word is hesed. It means God's unfailing, God's undying love. It means the same thing in the New Testament when he became a man in the form of Jesus to take our sins. It's something that he's willing to lay down his life for another purpose, for another cause, for another thing. Ruth here is doing that same thing. In the Old Testament, the word hesed is used to describe God, but it's also used to describe Ruth. No other times is it used, but for God and for Ruth. So here, we have a picture of a Moabite woman imitating and modeling herself after the God of Israel. Very interesting. Verse 19. Let's continue. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women of that town exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Then Naomi speaks. Naomi in verse 20 says, don't call me Naomi, which if you remember means pleasant or pleasant one. So she told them, call me Mara, which if you translate that means bitter. I'm not pleasant, I'm bitter. Why? Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Now we have to do some more translating here. The word Almighty is the word El Shaddai. That word right there means, El Shaddai means the providing and the protecting God. It's not that Naomi has completely abandoned God. It's not that Naomi has completely rejected God. In fact, she still claims God as her God. But what Naomi is doing here is she's saying, I have gone away and I have lost everything. The providing God, the protecting God has rejected me. God has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Literally it means I went away, or where is that verse? I went empty, or I went full, but Almighty has brought me back empty. I have nothing left anymore. Naomi did warn Ruth, didn't she? Naomi did tell Ruth, if you follow me, this is what your future would bring. I have nothing to offer you. I am bitter. That's why they wept. That's why they leaned on each other's shoulder and they wept loudly. I am a widow with nothing to my name. If you follow me, you have to realize that you will be opening yourself up to ridicule and shame that being a widow will offer. It's quite possible, Ruth, that this is the life you have chosen. Are you willing to accept that? And so the people of the town of Bethlehem ask upon her arrival, can this be Naomi? Can this be the pleasant one come back from Moab? Has the dead come back to life here in Israel? No, Naomi replies, I'm no longer pleasant, but bitter. Life has treated me harshly and cruelly. God has punished and abandoned me. I have nothing left. Even though it was Elimelech who brought me there, I'm blaming God. God's not a friend here, but he's a foe. In a way, he's the enemy. Full I went, but empty brought me back Yahweh. How could this happen to me? She wonders. The Almighty, the providing God, has left me with nothing. It's interesting. If you look at the word Almighty or El Shaddai, it could also mean that God, the providing, the protecting God, is at his best when our lives seem to be at their worst. The providing, the protecting God is at his best when our lives are empty and meaningless and without purpose. Paul, many years later, in 2 Corinthians, would put it this way: his strength is made perfect in weakness. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What in our own lives seems impossible to us? Have we given up when the bills come in at the same time we have no money to pay them? Do we feel weak and helpless when the doctor brings us bad news? What happens to us when we lose our job and there is nothing in the future to give us hope? Fortunately, God is a God of details. He knows what we need. He knows where we are. He knows what we're going through. We don't need to pack up and leave for Moab when times get hard, when hard times come our way. We only need to trust, to know that God knows what he is doing regardless of whether we see him at work or not. But God is always at work. In fact, look at verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Chapter 1 begins with a famine and ends with a harvest. Bring out the cookbooks. Bring out the recipes again. Chapter 1 started with a famine but ends with a harvest. God has not abandoned his people. Chapter 1